Hello and welcome back. I want to talk to you today about the shelter and the sleep system that I used on my Pacific Crest Trail. I started my PCT Thruhike on April the 15th and I completed my Thruhike on September the 28th. And so I spent a lot of nights in my shelter and sleeping many nights out in the wilderness on my sleep system. And so today I want to talk to you about the shelter that I used and the sleep system that I used on my Pacific Crest Trail Thruhike. Now, before I get started telling you about the things that I used and the gear that I found to be productive for me, let me make a few statements. First of all, I want to say that gear is subjective and personal. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that many people like the gear that they use for different reasons. Some people like it just because it's light. Some people like it because it's pretty. Some people like it because it's a particular color or whatever. And so the reason why we choose the gear that we do is very subjective and very personal. And so I just want to tell you about the gear that I used and that I found to be proficient and effective on my Pacific Crest Trail Thruhike. Now, another thing I want to say is that what works for me may not work for you. And so therefore, you've got to try out your gear before you take a Thruhike or even an overnight hike. You need to try it out. A lot of times I would watch a YouTube video of a hiker that I had a lot of confidence in, and that particular hiker suggested that that's what he used or she used for their tent or some type of piece of gear. And so I consequently went out and bought that piece of gear and tried it out on myself. Some of those pieces of gear worked, some of them didn't work. But at least I knew what worked for me, and what didn't work for me, even though it perhaps maybe worked for them. And then lastly, let me say this about gear. I am not a gear expert, all right, or gearhead, I think is what they call it. But I'm constantly learning. I'm constantly looking at YouTube videos. I'm constantly talking to other backpackers and other thru-hikers and finding out what they use and trying those things out. So I'm not the expert. I'm constantly learning, and you ought to do the same thing. The way I learned about gear is through trial and error. And that's the same way that you're going to learn about your gear as well. And what works for you is through trial and error. Go out on an overnight trip and try your gear out. And if it works, then use it. If it doesn't, then replace it. But don't ever get stuck in just with one particular piece of gear. Try other things. And perhaps maybe you can find something that's more proficient or lighter, or whatever reason why you choose that particular gear. Now again, let me say this, that what I'm giving you in the list, the gear list that I'm giving you is what worked for me or didn't work for me, and that's why I replaced it. But these are things that I'm giving you that work for me, and then perhaps they may work for you. Again, try it. You may like it. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get started. The tent that I started with from Campo, California, on the southern terminus, right next to the border of Mexico and California, was the Big Agnes Fly Creek It's a long name. The Big Agnes Fly Creek HV-UL2. Now, don't ask me to repeat that. It was a great tent. I enjoyed it. I used it for over 500 miles on the Pacific Crest Trail. And the reason why I chose it is because I saw another hiker, another thru hiker, who was hiking the PCT on YouTube. I saw him use that particular tent, so I thought I'd go out and try it. It was a very light tent and lighter than the other Big Agnes tents that were on the market. And so immediately I fell in love with it. Now the Big Agnes Fly Creek HV-UL2 consists of a main body which is made of mesh and sil nylon, a rain fly which is made strictly of sil nylon, a footprint which goes underneath the tent to protect the bottom, DAC poles, which are flexible but yet very strong, and 8 titanium Vargo stakes. In general, I love the tent. Again, as I said, it was very light compared to other tents. But the thing I didn't like about the tent was it only had one door, and that was at the very front. And it was kind of awkward to get in and to out and to get out of that tent because of that. But all in all, I love the tent. And in Tehachapi, I switched out my tent to a Z-Pax duplex tent. Now, even though the Big Agnes Fly Creek tent was very light, the Z-Pax duplex was half the weight that the Big Agnes tent was. And so, therefore, it appealed to me very much. Another reason why I switched to the Z-Pax duplex is because the Big Agnes tent consisted of a main body, rain fly, footprint, DAC poles, and stakes. There was just too many components to the tent, whereas the duplex was only one thing. It was the tent. The duplex tent was not a freestanding tent like the Big Agnes tent was. The duplex tent had to be staked out and provide tension to get a perfect pitch on that tent. It did not use separate poles. You used your trekking poles as the poles for the tent. The Z-Pax tent was waterproof, and so you didn't have to have a rain fly for it. It was a single wall tent. The duplex tent was made of a DCF material. It stands for Dyneema Composite Fabric Material, which is a very strong material, and it's also waterproof. Now, one of the biggest drawbacks for the duplex tent was it was very expensive. And so I had to promise my wife many, many things in order for her to not kill me for spending that much money on a particular tent. Another thing is the duplex tent did fail on me about a couple of weeks before the end of my hike. The zippers on both sides of the tent failed. I did, when I got back home, send it in to Z-Pax, and they fixed the tent and sent it back to me with no charge. And so I appreciated that. But as far as my shelter was concerned, I started off with the Big Agnes Fly Creek tent, and then in Tehachapi, I went to the Z-Pax duplex tent, and I hiked with that tent for over 2,000 miles to the end of my PCT journey. Next, let's talk about the sleeping pad that I used on my PCT journey. I started out from Campo with the Thermarest Neo Air X Lite, very popular sleeping pad. Many hikers use it on the trail, and I loved it. It was very, very light. One of the lightest, if not the lightest, pad on the market. But there was two things. First of all, it was very noisy. It sounded, a lot of people say it sounded like potato chips rolling around on a bag of potato chips. And so it was very loud. And then number two, I kept rolling off of it at night. It wasn't very wide. And so again, in South Lake Tahoe, I switched to the Sea to Summit ultralight insulated pad. Now the Sea to Summit insulated pad had these things called air sprung cells, and they were very, very comfortable, and it was also a little bit wider than the Thermarest Neolite X-Lite. Man, I wish I'd shorten these names. But anyway, the Thermarest pad was too narrow for me, and I kept rolling off of it, but the Sea to Summit pad was very comfortable, and I finished the PCT with that Sea to Summit pad, but I switched it out in South Lake Tahoe, and I finished out the rest of the trail with that particular sleeping pad. Now let's talk about another piece of gear that I used on the Pacific Crest Trail through hike, and that was a pillow. Now, I used at the first what I would do is I would take the clothes that I wasn't using and I would stuff it into my clothes sack, and I would use that as a pillow at night, not having to bring a pillow. But I got to thinking about it. If I'm cold and I have to put on all the clothes that I brought with me, I'm not going to have a pillow to sleep on. And so I took with me, and I started off with the Sea to Summit Aeros Premium Pillow. And then in Tehachapi, I switched to the Sea to Summit Aeros Ultralight Pillow. Now, to be honest with you, I don't really remember the reason why I switched to it, except it was just a few ounces lighter. Again, gear is subjective and personal. On my PCT through hike, I decided to use a quilt as opposed to a sleeping bag. For several trips that I had taken, overnight trips and section hike trips, I had used the Enlightened Equipment Enigma 30 degree, I believe, the 30 degree bag or quilt. And so I started from Campo with that particular quilt, and it served me very well. It kept me very warm. I had to make sure that the quilt was tucked underneath me at night and that there was no drafts. But other than that, it kept me very warm. Now when I got to Tehachapi, I switched out the Enigma from a 30 degree Enigma to a 10 degree Enigma quilt. And the only reason why is because I was going into the Sierra, and it was a lot colder at night, and so it served me well. But then when I got to South Lake Tahoe, I switched out the 10 degree back to the 30 degree, and that's what I ended my Pacific Crest Trail through hike with. It's my Enlightened Equipment 30 degree Enigma quilt. Now, trekking poles is not exactly a piece of shelter or a sleep system, but it's one of those pieces of gear that was that I could use for uses. It's multi-purpose. It can be used for hiking, and it was also used for my tent poles on my duplex tent. I had been using the Leakey cork light for years, and so I started in Campo with that particular trekking pole, and I used it all the way to the end of my hike. Now, the only difference was when I started off in Campo, and since I had a tent that had dedicated poles that I used with that particular tent, I only used one trekking pole. When I got the Z-Packs tent, I went to 2 trekking poles because it used 2 trekking poles to set the tent up. So that is all the equipment, that's all the gear that I used for my shelter and my sleep system. It's so funny how that we think that a little piece of material is going to protect us from bears and from other wild animals. And so that was always very hilarious to me. But the tent that I used, the sleeping system I used, served me very well all the way through to the end of my through hike. If you want to know the weight of every piece of gear that I took with me on my PCT hike, you can go to the description section below and you can click on the link that I've included. It will take you to a list of different sections on the PCT and the different gear that I took with me on that particular section. You can also print up the list if you'd like and use it next time that you go to look for gear. If you have any questions whatsoever or any comments, please leave that in the comments section below and I will get back to you just as soon as I can. So, until next time, I'll see you down the trail.